You get me, got you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, got you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, got you. You get me.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. I can't wait. The Democracy Group is actually getting together in person in Washington, D.C. I can't wait for all of us to get together. It's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Remember also to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on your favorite podcast app. Review all the shows review this show on all those apps, and certainly join our Patreon. We have links in the show notes to make this stuff easy to find. It really does help. Every bit of it helps, so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with McKay Coppins. McKay Coppins is an award-winning writer at The Atlantic. He is also, which by the way, if you get a chance, every time a McKay Coppins piece comes out, I immediately gravitate towards it because his access and well, we'll get into it. I don't want to plug him before we even get into the conversation, but McKay is also the author of The Wilderness, a book about the battle over the future of the Republican Party, and the excellent biography of Mitt Romney that came out in late 2023. McKay Coppins, this is so cool. Thank you so much for joining us. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. And I think you plugged and praised me plenty. I don't think we need to do any more of it in the conversation. But
All right.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I guess I should go take journalism 101 because that's not typically what a journalist of the top tier would do right out of the gate. But
No.
actually, so this might. I was going to start with like your background and how you first got into journalism, but I was just reading this morning a piece from about 11 years ago, a little over 11 years ago, called 36 Hours on the Fake Campaign Trail with Donald Trump. And since I praised you so much, I just got to ask you, like, oh, how much you got wrong.
Oh man. Man.
There's actually,
You
so go ahead. Sorry. There was so
no,
much
no,
that you
no.
actually got right, but there was so.
It is it's my most notorious piece of my career for sure. And not a story that I thought I would be telling for the rest of my life when I wrote it at the time. I thought it was kind of a fun sort of throwaway piece. Just to briefly recap readers who or listeners who haven't read it. In 2014, I pitched Trump's people on uh, doing a kind of mini profile of him. And at the time, he was talking about running for governor of New York. This was early 2014.
Right.
And then was also kind of throwing in like, or maybe I'll just run for president, that kind of thing, right? And he had been doing this for so long at that point. I think he first flirted with running for president in the late 90s. That I kind of thought it was clearly just a play for publicity. And I pitched him on kind of going up to see him give a speech in New Hampshire and then interviewing him on his flight back to New York aboard the kind of Trump plane, right? And they went for it. And so in, I think, January 2014, I went up there. I saw his speech. Afterward, I got into a black SUV with him and we started driving to the tarmac. And on the drive there, he got a call from his pilot saying, "Hey, there's a blizzard in New York. The airports are shut down. What do you want to do?" And he said, "Let's skip New York altogether and go straight to Palm Beach," which is where he had, Mar-a-Lago. And somebody in the car with us kind of said, "Hey, there's this reporter here. What do you want us to do with him?" And Trump just said, "Oh, just bring him along." So I ended up spending on accident 2 days at Donald Trump's house in Palm Beach and wrote this piece that kind of captured my whole like misadventure with him, tried to capture what he was like. And I think that stuff holds up pretty well.
Yeah.
But I very famously predicted that he would never run for president, and that the whole thing was just a play for Celebrity Apprentice ratings, and he should not be taken seriously. And Donald Trump, of all people, has never let me forget it. Uh, in fact, a few days before he officially accepted the Republican nomination in 2016, this was after he announced and won the primaries and was about to go to Cleveland and accept the nomination. I got an email from him saying, in effect, look how wrong you were. about me, and you said I would never run, and not only did I run, but I won the nomination, and just watch what happens next. And
Oh man.
so that has kind of been that's my defining Trump story, which I think I've taken a lot of lessons from, but one of them is to be more humble in your predictions as a journalist and pundit, because if anything we've learned the last 10 years, the strange and surprising things can happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, like I said, there was so much that still resonates really true. One of which, there was a way that your account, your experience at Mar-a-Lago, almost 10 years later, you wrote the biography on Mitt Romney and his story of his, weird experience at I think he was governor of Mass, or maybe he was, I think he was governor of Massachusetts at the time that he had this visit to Mar-a-Lago, maybe post Massachusetts governor.
It was actually before. I think he had
Oh,
run for Senate and then lost, but he was like back at Bain. But yeah, that's right. When he went and he visited Mar-a-Lago. On kind of I think it was like they wanted they want they I think Trump wanted, or Bain wanted Trump's business. I can't remember. There's some kind, it was some kind of business thing, but basically Trump invited Romney down, and it was just this totally surreal spectacle.
yeah,
And again, it's funny because I feel like a lot of people had these Mar-a-Lago experiences with Trump over the years before he became president that
yeah,
at the time just seemed like weird, funny stories to tell your wife, when you get
right.
home. And in retrospect, took on this kind of really like a lot of gravity and almost kind of a menacing air, right? In retrospect. But
Right. Well, one of the central themes that was emerging in that piece, the BuzzFeed piece, was Trump very badly wants to be taken seriously. In that case, as a political
yeah.
candidate, but it almost seems like it's this bottomless well that you just cannot fill.
Hmm.
He at every level, there's this, C.S. Lewis would refer to it as the God-shaped void, right?
Yeah.
But there's
Yeah.
this void that just can't seem to be filled to this day, and now we're seeing mythological proportions of that.
Yeah, that was actually my take on him, and why the piece that I wrote, I think in some ways was kind of sympathetic. Like, I mean, he didn't like, my description of his decorating style or his hair, whatever, those little triggers. But ultimately, I thought of him as kind of a tragic figure. And I had a lot of empathy for him back in 2014 because I felt like he was this guy who, like, was really lonely in a
Yeah.
way,
Oh yeah.
like even though he was like walking into ballrooms and getting applauded and
Sir.
surrounded by like yes men who were on his payroll, like it didn't seem like he had that many people in his life who he felt actually knew him and
Mm,
cared about him and could maybe ground him, right? And maybe he didn't want that. I think his life was the result of the choices he'd made, but like he seemed like he desperately wanted affirmation all the time from everybody around him. And it was like empty calories when he got it, right? Like even me, I was like a 25-year-old BuzzFeed reporter, maybe
yeah.
26. Like, what did I know? Why would he care about my opinion? But the whole time I was there, he was like trying to solicit my like approval or esteem. He was trying to get me to compliment his plane. He wanted me
Yeah.
to kind of be impressed with his house and like and even when he got it from the people around him, you could tell that like it momentarily filled that void you're talking about, but then he went right back to needing more of it. And I feel like that is actually kind of the defining characteristic of Trump, is that he desperately wants to be taken seriously, to be respected, to be loved and affirmed, and but it's never enough, right?
One of the other things I was curious about is that you describe scenes like in New Hampshire in that piece where other reporters, other journalists are trying to get access, even begrudgingly. They seem to be there on assignment begrudgingly, and yet there's really no access except for maybe the scrum that he shares some
Yeah.
tidbits with. But you again and again, like as a young reporter in your 20s. getting such access. And just in the last couple of years, the biography I mentioned on Mitt Romney, or the piece in the Atlantic on the Murdochs, I was curious how you were able to get such intimate access to the subjects of pieces like these.
Yeah, it has been something that I've been lucky to get. And I think I could not answer this question without first just pointing to the luck. And I think like a big part of this kind of journalism is luck. Like and yes, to a certain extent, you make your own luck. You have to ask for the access. You have to put yourself in a position where, you know, fluky things might happen and you kind of get taken along for the ride. That was what happened with Trump, right? He
Right.
agreed to what effectively would have been like a 1 hour interview on his plane. But, you know, I was there with him and it turned out that they couldn't land at LaGuardia. And then all of a sudden I'm staying at his house in Palm Beach, right? So part of it is just kind of like putting yourself out there. And I think that's one of the most fun things about journalism is that
Yeah.
like going on these adventures, just getting out there, following your curiosities and seeing what happens. But I also think that like in negotiating a lot of intimate access to people, and especially this has especially been true in the last probably like 5 years of my career, like I really don't want to profile somebody who I don't already who I think I already know everything about, right? Like
Mm,
I don't want to set out to write a profile with a pre-written angle or like preformed narrative in my mind, right? And some writers do that. And honestly, if I'm being honest, early in my career, when I was probably less secure and less skilled, I would do that too. I would go into a story with kind of a preconceived idea of what the story would be, and it was based on my conversations with editors and research, so it wasn't just kind of random, but I would go out there and just try to like get the material I needed to tell the story I wanted to tell. And
interesting.
that is not, I think, the best way, most honest way to do journalism. And it's not a recipe for getting subjects to really open up to you. I find, at least have found in my career, that like subjects are really disarmed by sincere curiosity in a writer, like and an open mind, right? And so whether it's Mitt Romney or the Murdochs, I certainly have like notions about them and I have an idea of why they would make for a good story, why they have a good story to tell. But I also try to go in with an open enough mind that that I can tell them honestly, like I have a lot of questions that I don't know the answers to, and in a sense, this is going to be a collaboration. Ultimately, I have editorial control. I'm not going to let you veto things. I'm not going to let you read the story beforehand and edit it. Like it's not that kind of collaboration, but it's a collaboration in the sense that I want to get in the room with you, and in exchange for your trust in me and really opening up to me and letting your guard down and being vulnerable and candidly answering difficult questions, um, I'm going to give you sincere curiosity, an open mind, and a willingness to have my preconceived notions about you proven wrong. And that's kind of like the fundamental trade in a biographer subject relationship or profile writer subject relationship. Like I'm going to approach this in enough of a spirit of open-mindedness and generosity that you will in turn feel willing to really open up and tell me the truth as you understand it. And I find that that's not a very complicated concept like what I'm explaining, I think, but I think it's rare enough that it has really worked for me in terms of getting that kind of intimate access.
That could be pretty scary, though, to lead with genuine curiosity, a sense of sincere inquiry, without knowing what's going to come out the other side. I've heard you describe a little bit I don't know how to refer to it, but like the nitty gritty part of writing, like your 3 in the morning process. You know, I wonder if you're able to enter into that spirit of inquiry with curiosity because you also trust in the nitty gritty part of it, your ability to hammer it out and articulate the story that presents itself to you as opposed to the story that you preconceived.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that like the part of the process where I have all the material and now I have to figure out what to do with it is the hardest part.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like the most, intellectually, psychologically, emotionally taxing part. It's also the most physically taxing part. Like you mentioned, I'm a late night writer. I also have four kids, who some of whom are very young, and so I can't really sleep in that much. So when I'm really in the depth of the writing process, I'm sleep deprived and addled and distracted, but I'm also like, it's because I'm really trying to, get it right. And
Mm.
you're right that like when I'm in the room with somebody talking to them, it's often the case that somebody will say something and I'm like, that's great. That's definitely going to go in the book or the piece, right? Like that's a great anecdote. That's a great quote. Um, Often though, I'm really just kind of sitting back and trying to have a conversation and understand what the person is telling me. And yeah, I do trust myself that like I'll be able to figure out what it all means later. And that trust just comes with like doing it a lot. And I think that's true of anybody getting good at something. They spend a lot of time doing it, like, right? Like the more you've done it somewhat successfully, the more you can trust that you'll be able to do it again. Although I do think that writers are a special kind of like neurotic breed where even though I say that I trust myself and I've done it successfully, every piece at some point feels like a crisis. Like at some point I will have a crisis moment where I'm like, I don't have the story. This guy is not giving me what I need, or I don't know what to make all of this, or I don't have anything new to say, or whatever. I think that those crisis moments just get shorter and shorter the more experience you get.
Yeah. Yeah. You're reminding me of another hat that I wear. Our other show is called Trailer Geeks and Teaser Gods about the entertainment advertising industry. So I've had the opportunity to talk to what's called trailer editors. So the guys who make the coming attractions. And a lot of the best ones will say the scariest moment is when they open up their computer and they're looking at a blank timeline,
Yeah,
you know? And no matter
right.
how many times they've created these seminal pieces, like pieces
Yeah.
that even just the average movie fan knows, the Social Network teaser or
Oh
Little
man.
Children teaser.
I showed the Social Network teaser to my kids, actually my older kids, the other day, just because it's so good. The
Oh,
one with the Radiohead song, the
yeah.
like, it's so amazing. And I showed it to them to see if they wanted to watch the movie, and it didn't really entice them, although they liked the trailer. But my older daughter ended up wanting to watch it. But yeah, no, I think that's a real thing. I mean, this is like it's almost a cliche with the writer that like there's nothing scarier than the blank page, right?
Yeah.
Like opening it up. Um, I have I don't know if I've really talked about this in an interview, but my process of avoiding the blank page as much as possible is that as soon as I open it up, I don't do like a vomit draft. Some writers do what they call a vomit draft, where it's
Yeah.
like you just
I
like
always got a spit take out. You
I'm
always got a
sorry, I
spit.
should have waited for you to put down the coffee. Um, I don't do exactly that, but it's almost worse than a vomit draft because what I do is I put on a caps lock on my keyboard. So it's all caps, and I immediately start kind of quasi outlining the piece.
Okay.
Like the first section, it's in all caps, like what the guy said about this, what he said about this. And it's kind of almost stream of consciousness, but it's just to like give myself like general markers of where I'm going. And I think psychologically, I do it in caps lock because I trick my brain into being like, this isn't actually prose that's going to go into the draft. So it doesn't have to be good. Like this is in all caps. You're going to rewrite this.
Yeah.
So I put it in all caps to kind of like convince myself that it's okay to put it on the page, even though it's not fully formed and clearly not polished yet.
So that sounds like a response. I don't know if you've ever read George Orwell wrote an essay specifically about political writing, and his
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
one of his suggestions was don't articulate something, don't put something into words until you have the right words or the right phrases, because once you put it into words, you risk the possibility of assigning the idea to
Yes,
cliche,
yes,
right?
yep.
Whereas if you're just like word vomiting, you're going completely the other way with it. So,
I like that Orwell is giving me permission to be the like obsessive neurotic 3 a.m. writer that I am. Because I have to say, I do sometimes think my editors at The Atlantic or my editor at Scribner are kind of like, man, can you just like give me something a little less polished but on time? Like I will take your on deadline piece, even if it's like a little less polished, because we'll polish it up for you. But I just can't, I really have a hard time doing that. That's not to say my editors still edit a lot and they help me polish, but I have a hard time turning in something that like that is not at least like coherently expressing what I'm trying to express, you
well,
know?
to your point, I heard, I think I forget when the book fest was, maybe three weeks ago, plus or minus, and you alluded to the that there's this new forthcoming piece in the Atlantic. So every day I'm refreshing your page, like, when's the McKay piece coming out? I want to, before we talk. So
Yeah, well, to that point, I just had a conversation with my editor right before doing this, where she was like, "So when is that piece coming?" And I was
right,
like,
right, right.
Next week, any day now, I promise." Wait, can we sideline here and you can cut this if you want, but
Sure.
I have to ask you because you brought up trailers and teasers.
Yeah.
Have you seen the teaser for the movie Weapons, the 2025 movie Weapons that's coming out? I guess it's like a mystery thriller horror thing.
I'm gonna
Um,
ask my
I,
friends who
I
did it.
I'm
Weapons.
not actually a horror movie person, but this one, the premise is that like it seems like everybody basically like one small town in the middle of the night, every child in the town
Right.
uh disappeared, and there's footage of them walking out. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm curious who did it, and props to them.
Okay,
Let
so my educated guess is it's this guy named Bill Neal. Bill Neal is an editor who's done almost every major horror film trailer for the last 25 years. And he is the
Wow.
quintessential guy who, as Texas Chainsaw, like just every great horror trailer film, especially the ones coming out of Warner. So that's my guess. But he's a lovely, lovely human being. But he has this tendency to just like, oh, they're really going to be onto me now. There's no way that I could get this. Like, he's brilliant. He's wonderful, but he's still like just
Yeah.
terrified that this is the one that everybody's going to be onto me and know that I'm like hack. So
Solidarity, brother. We all feel that way.
I'm going to have to
I
tell
know how
Bill
that
that
feels.
that he got a
That,
shout out on the politics show.
let him know.
I was also. It sounds like you had journalism was something that you were keenly interested in at a relatively early age. How did you first realize it was something that you had a knack for or were really interested in it?
Um, well, I don't know if this proved that I had a knack for it, but as early as like I think I was probably 10 or something. I with my younger siblings started a like Coppins family newspaper that we
Oh,
called The Scoop. And we would hand draw and hand write the articles and the cartoons and stuff, and then we would make photocopies on our home photocopy printer thing and distribute to, I think, just my parents, basically. So early on, I found that I liked it. I mean, for me, writing was the way that I got into journalism. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I thought for a long time, I mean, a long time, I think for a lot of my like teenage years, I thought I would be like a fiction writer. Um, and then uh, I thought of journalism as kind of an outlet for writing. And I started writing a column for my local newspaper. It was like an attempt at a humor column. I lived in a small town in Massachusetts. And then I became the editor of my high school newspaper. And I think when I became the editor of my high school paper was when I like started to fall in love with the troublemaking aspects of journalism, like we would publish these articles that were like really controversial in our school, and our principal would get mad, and I'd get called into the principal's
oh,
office and I'd have to defend why we published this or that. And I had a great teacher who taught a journalism class in high school called Miss Flatley. She was also my English teacher. I really loved her. She actually passed away a few years ago,
oh,
but she just really encouraged it and encouraged the impulse, and so did my parents. And I still didn't know if I wanted to be a journalist. And then it was actually when I got to college, I went to BYU, where we had a I had like an introductory journalism class. And in that class, the professor introduced us to what he was calling literary journalism. But you could call it narrative journalism, long form journalism, whatever. And it was kind of my first exposure to it. Like in high school, I was not reading like Gay Talese and Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion.
Yeah, yeah.
But like in college, like I was reading these like Pulitzer Prize winning feature series that were ran in the Oregonian or great magazine pieces. And I kind of realized that I could do the kind of writing I thought I could only do in fiction, but do it in nonfiction and in journalism. And from that point on, that was kind of how I had committed myself. And my dream always was to write long form pieces for magazines. That was kind of
Wow.
what I always wanted to do. So I am one of those annoying people who figured out pretty early in life what I wanted to do, and I've been lucky enough to get to do it.
And how did you develop? You mentioned before that a lot of it is just getting your reps in. So developing your process, is that something you learned from others, or is it just something that you developed over time and doing, just write? Just the best way to learn how to write is just to write.
Well, it's definitely to write, but the second best way to learn how to write is to read. And so it's, like I got in a lot of reps. Like I said, it probably helps that I started when I was like 10, right? But but more than that, I do think, studying the great journalists and writers and kind of soaking up their advice and reading everything they wrote and just trying to kind of expose myself to as much great writing as possible. That really is that was, I think, how I did it. Like I in college, I started to read all these different like anthologies of new journalism, and I would read all these great magazines. And then I had my first internship out of college was at Newsweek magazine, and we had this great series every week. The interns would meet with a different writer or editor, and so I got to hear from John Meacham and Evan Thomas and Jonathan Alter, and they would kind of like give their whole spiels about their work and their process. And I just kind of soaked that up as much as
Mm,
possible. And again, I'm not saying anything original, but like if you want to be great at something, yes, you have to work really hard at it. You also have to expose yourself to the greats, right? And
yeah,
so if you're a filmmaker, you have to watch all the great films.
right.
And if you're lucky enough to have access to them, talk to the great filmmakers. And that was kind of again, I think followed my curiosity to just kind of trying to learn as much about the process of these great magazine writers as possible.
And now you've worked with some of the greats. I mean, in terms of
Yeah.
investigative journalism, Tim Alberta writes some wonderful pieces, but so many
Yep.
of your colleagues at the Atlantic are among my favorites. David French was there. David Brooks drops pieces there. So many different David Frum, since we're on the Davids. Yeah,
Yeah, just hit all the Davids.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no. No, it's true. And I remember coming to the Atlantic, and I was 29 when I joined the Atlantic, so I was still relatively young. And um, I remember like my first, I don't know, week or two, like James Fallows came up and introduced himself. Ta-Nehisi Coates came up and introduced himself. You
Mm,
like really kind of quickly, I met David Frum for the first time. Like I think like and Jeffrey Goldberg. I mean, you have to say
oh,
he was the editor in chief, but
yeah.
also is like one of the great magazine writers of his generation. Like he um he really took me under his wing and taught me a lot. Like I had being at a place like the Atlantic, it really is like in addition to a great platform to write and a great place to publish, like it's also a great place to just learn from some of the very best in the business.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's something that I've just, again, I'm lucky to be here.
Now, you mentioned a story from when you were in school, how you'd write a piece and the principal would call you in and give you some crap about it. That was perhaps your introduction to the First Amendment challenges. Um,
Yes.
but there are some very, to my eye, there are some very concrete threats to not just freedom of press, but any number of the freedoms just right there in the First Amendment.
Mhm.
Is that something that you're feeling right now? Or are you doing what you're doing regardless of what the political social climate is?
I've tried to just continue to do what I do, right? And I think that that's been the approach of my colleagues here at the Atlantic, is to meet this moment not with panic or hysteria, but also not with like alarmism, but to
Mhm.
just genuinely try to report what's happening, explain what's happening, contextualize it, tell important stories. Um, but you do feel it in the industry in general. I mean, there is a definite chilling effect of when you have a president who is willing to wield his power in kind of unprecedented ways, and who has very explicitly said that journalists are the enemy of the people. Um, that can't help but have an effect um, on how the industry operates. And then you pair that with the fact that some media owners um, have shown an unusual willingness to kind of cozy up to this administration. I think not for political or ideological reasons, but because they fear retribution, right? There have
Yeah.
also been settlements in these kind of big cases, where defamation cases with Trump, where a lot of lawyers say that the outlets probably could have won, but the bosses kind of decided it was in their best interest to just settle. And I think that again has a chilling effect on the industry, especially on smaller, less well-funded outlets, right? So at the Atlantic, like, we are a profitable magazine owned by a multi-billionaire who is very supportive of our journalism. There are other places like the New York Times is like this big, media company that has a ton of money and clout and power. But you think about like small nonprofit outlets or local newspapers that don't have that kind of backing, and you have to assume that their coverage of things, issues close to the Trump administration, they're at least going to have the thought like, should we calibrate this? Should we hedge a little? Should we be careful because the Justice Department could come after us? That we could get sued. I do think that there has been this kind of chill in the air, and it's disconcerting.
Yeah, no, certainly we hear about some of the high profile cases, whether it's ABC settling for something George Stephanopoulos said, or pressure that's being asserted on Paramount's parent company in a merger that
Hmm.
they're trying because of something that was said on 60 Minutes. There's any number of cases, but also at the regional level. To your point, I think the suit against the Des Moines Register is still, and Ann Seltzer is still open because there was a poll that he didn't like
Yeah.
pre-election. And it is scary, and to a degree, it's already working. Even if these suits, and every company and every individual has to make a decision for themselves. But in a way, it's already working in that there are stories that aren't being told because it's not worth the risk in this climate. And I think
Totally.
that is a material attack on First Amendment rights.
I
Um,
totally agree. I mean, and I think you've seen this at a bunch of different institutions, right? Like, think of these law firms that the Trump administration targeted with executive orders in the first weeks of his presidency. You have this major Democratic law firm, Paul Weiss,
right.
where Trump issues an executive order saying, in effect, that employees of this law firm will have their security clearances revoked, can't have access to government buildings, can't have any government contracts, which would, if upheld, effectively decimate their business, right? Make it impossible for them to defend their clients effectively. Um, so what does Paul Weiss do? Theoretically, this firm would be well equipped to defend themselves in such a lawsuit, or to sue and to kind of make the case that this executive order is unconstitutional. They might even win, but how long will it take for the Supreme Court to rule on that question? And in the meantime, how much money will they lose? How many clients will they lose? And so the calculation that was made by the president of the firm was, it's better for me to go to the White House hat in hand and cut a deal with Trump directly.
Right.
And that decision, that calculation, then filters down to the rest of the big law world, right? Where every other big law firm is basically saying, we better not take on clients that the Trump administration doesn't like because we could be next, right? We better not fight them in court too hard because they could, use the levers of federal power to take apart our business. And like, again, it's possible that in the end, the courts will defend the rule of law and deem these things unconstitutional, but a lot of damage can be done in the meantime while that process plays out. And I think Trump and his allies understand that.
Yeah, I'm hoping that whether it's in a business or academia or politics, that there are, I mean, we've just seen this week that Harvard said, oh no, we're pushing back. And then that will, that other institutions of higher learning, or media outlets or law firms will follow suit. Sarah Isger's theory is that the more attacks that are waged across all of these different domains, the weaker overall it is, because if there's no law firms for clients to go to, they're all enemies of the Trump
Yeah.
administration. Then they're all more on an equal footing. But I do wonder, maybe it's my rose-colored glasses, that as opposed to Trump 1.0, there were leaders that identified Trump maybe more as an empty vessel. For example, in politics, we look at all the Trump-appointed judges and justices. I actually see, I see a lot of them more as Mitch McConnell-appointed justices from Trump 1.0,
Hmm.
right? Or the accommodations that business leaders, to your point, were making prior to his second term here in 2020, the election in 2024, that they were operating pragmatically. But now that we're seeing the very real attacks on so many different fronts, I'm wondering if institutions and leaders will realize what's actually at stake, and that there will be a more potent resistance that
Yeah.
emerges from this class of leaders.
Yeah, I think there could be a backlash. I also think that a lot of the accommodation that was happening early in the Trump term, or even before the term started, came on the back of Trump winning a kind of surprisingly decisive presidential election. He actually won the popular vote. He won every swing state. He improved in almost every state in the country. And so, there was this sense that there's a real vibe shift going on in American politics, and people, he's more popular than ever. Fast forward less than 100 days, his approval ratings are already back down to the low 40s, high
Yeah.
30s. It's clear that he doesn't have kind of this massive popular movement behind him. And I think when people predict that America will kind of slide into like Putin style autocracy, the thing that's missing is that in a lot of those countries, and most of those countries, the political leaders who trigger the democratic backsliding and are able to consolidate power usually have a lot of popular support. Like
Hmm.
Putin is very popular in Russia, right? Erdogan is popular in Turkey. Donald Trump is not that popular. It's in fact like has almost never had an approval rating above 50%, at least sustained for more than a couple of weeks. And so I think that what you're describing is kind of the inevitable laws of political gravity reasserting themselves. Again, that doesn't diminish the amount of damage that can be done to democratic institutions in the meantime, but I do think there will be an eventual kind of course correction. I will also say, to your point specifically about the Supreme Court, and I think Sarah Isgur has talked about this too, but like I've done some reporting on the Supreme Court. I wrote a profile of Brett Kavanaugh a few years ago, and my sense is that the the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, with a couple of exceptions, are not as captured by Donald Trump as some liberals assume, right?
Right.
Like even the conservative justices, maybe set aside Clarence Thomas or whatever. I don't know, but like for the most part, Gorsuch, Barrett, certainly Roberts, like these are justices who believe in a lot of conservative ideas, but I think they're going to be very skeptical of a lot of the moves that the Trump administration is making. And I think that if you want to look at a potentially positive outcome of this period of aggressive kind of instability and an assault on these institutions, is that we might come out the other side with a kind of jurisprudence or a bunch of precedents that actually constrain the power of the executive branch more than has been the case in the past. Because I think a lot of these conservative justices are not going to be on board with a lot of what Trump is doing. And I think that a lot of centrists and liberals might be surprised by how often the Supreme Court, as conservative as it is, will be willing to kind of buck the Trump administration. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think we've already started to see some of it.
No, I think you're largely right. There have been one or two high-profile cases, like on presidential immunity, that went very much in Trump's favor. But
Yeah.
one case after another that's gone to the Supreme Court, especially if you start to dig in and read the actual opinions, in particular of the three Trump-appointed justices, they come from a much more nuanced conservative legal theory than, and a lot of these cases we're seeing now on the emergency docket are being decided, by the text of the Constitution, by the text of the Bill of Rights. It's pretty clear cut. So I think you're right in that regard. Where I'm concerned is the judicial branch is only one branch. The legislative branch right now has basically allowed itself to be used, or forgotten about altogether by the executive branch. So that's where I have concerns. Speaking of which, you use the term. I love this term. I might make it a bumper sticker. But you use the term at the Atlantic Book Fest, transmogrification, the transmogrification of the Republican Party. I'm curious if you speak to Republican leaders who still say behind closed doors that they're grateful for the dissidents, as we'd call them, the Romneys and the Cheneys and the Kinsingers. And I'm also, if you do, like, I'm curious what the internal rationalizations are at this point.
I think there is less of that today than there was 8 years ago. Eight
Okay.
years ago, even 5 years ago, it was very common to hear Republican members of Congress, especially, tell you in private, yeah, this Trump is crazy, he's a clown, this stuff that he's doing is really bad, but there's no upside in me kind of speaking out against it, and ultimately it's gonna flame out or whatever. There is always some rationalization. I write about this in my book. Mitt Romney would have Republican senators come up to him and say this all the time,
Right.
right? And it drove him crazy. And he started counting how many Republican senators would come up to him and say, I'm so glad that you're out there, standing up to Trump. I obviously can't do it because I have an election to win, but and it drove him crazy. And there still is some of that. I will say that a couple of things that have changed are that, one, a lot of those Republicans have basically just washed out of of Congress or the Senate. Like every couple years, MAGA diehards replace, at least a couple of kind of old guard Republicans in primaries. There has been a huge wave of retirements over the last 10 years as people like Mitt Romney and just don't want to hang around anymore, right? They can't stand to be in Washington anymore. Um, and I also think that there is a degree to which sitting members of Congress who used to say that stuff have been genuinely converted to Trump style politics, or at least they've convinced themselves they are, right? Out of convenience. Like I think there are people like Mike Lee, the Utah senator, who called on Trump to drop out of the race after the Access Hollywood tape and is now one of Donald Trump's most steadfast supporters and will defend anything he does, basically. And I think some of that is political convenience, and some of it is that he sort of has been red pilled and radicalized the way that a lot of Trump supporters have been. And Trump himself is very good at using a combination of menacing and threats and bullying, as well as kind of charm offensive to win these people over. And I think a lot of them just don't anymore. They don't want to sit in the cognitive dissonance anymore, right?
Mm.
Like a lot of them have just kind of convinced themselves, I either need to get out or I need to tell myself that I support all of this. And so I don't feel like I'm being a coward by not opposing it publicly. And that said, there certainly still are people out there, like I would say John Thune is probably one of them, who is he replaced McConnell as the Republican Senate leader, and by all accounts, does not think very highly of Trump or Trump style politics, but is playing a long game where his rationalization, and I think you would hear this from other Republicans, is basically um, I don't accomplish anything by publicly speaking out against Trump. What I can do is accomplish quite a bit by pretending to be on his side and holding my fire, but then maneuvering behind the scenes. And I think that that's the calculation Thune is making, and a lot of other senators and members of Congress. And I get the calculation. I would just say that we have seen this calculation at work for the better part of a decade now. And I don't know if it has had the results that its practitioners would hope that it would have, right? Like, I think that maybe you've had some wins. Paul Ryan was a big, when he
Yeah.
was Speaker of the House, was a big, I'm going to accommodate Trump to a certain extent, but really so I can get good things done and hold him accountable behind the scenes and keep the train on the tracks. And I don't know. I guess you have to look at the situation and decide how much has the train remained on the tracks. But to me, it feels like it's careening pretty wildly out of control, the democratic crisis that America's in. And I don't know if we're still getting that much out of these kind of reasonable Republicans who are holding their tongues so they can have influence behind the scenes.
Paul Ryan is a great example of someone who he accommodated very early in Trump 1.0 in order to get that 2017 tax law through. But I think about it sometimes on a human level. I have to think about Paul Ryan looking at that bill and realizing that what ended up getting through looked nothing like that legislation that he was working on as a
Yeah,
young staffer in
right.
Jack Kemp's staff. Um,
And a lot of the key provisions were temporary anyway. Were set to expire after a certain number of years. And like, yeah, like, I mean, I profiled Paul Ryan a long time ago, and I spent a lot of time with him. And clearly a very bright guy. I think he is really earnest in a lot of ways. Like, he really believes in these ideas, like you said, the Jack Kemp style conservatism. I remember following him around Indianapolis as he was meeting with a bunch of different people working on anti-poverty programs, and he was trying to see how he could like work those ideas into his budget work in Congress. And I think it was all pretty sincere, but like when the rubber hits the road, I think what happened was that he wanted to get something done, and and he wanted the power to do it, and so he compromised on a lot of stuff to get it done. And you would have to ask him whether in the kind of cosmic balance sheet he came out on the right end. But I think that a lot of these political wins that Republicans are getting out of cozying up to Trump are not going to be remembered when the history books are written. But what will be remembered is all these really kind of wild things, these destructive, damaging things that Trump has done. And if these members of Congress are remembered at all, they will be remembered as allies of Donald Trump in doing that stuff. And that's why I think, and Mitt Romney and I used to talk about this a lot, to get better outcomes in our politics, one thing that really needs to change is our political leaders need to start thinking more in terms of their obituaries and less in terms of kind of the next news cycle, right?
so that's a really great point, and I wonder the question that occurs to me when I think about individuals, whether it's a Marco Rubio or a Lindsey Graham. So about a year and a half ago, Will Salatan did this incredible profile of Lindsey Graham as sort of
Yeah.
a proxy, if you will, for other Republicans. My question is, what of their soul? You talk about accommodations and justifications and one after the other after the other. At a certain point, does does your soul start to, I don't know, maybe this is too deep for this conversation, but I'm curious
No.
if you have thought about that, if you've gotten a sense of that this is a different person whose soul is slowly being suffocated, or sense of, I don't know, the numinous, if you will, is
Yeah.
being snuffed out.
I think about it all the time, actually. I don't think it's too deep in this conversation because I think it's actually one of the elements of this political era that I'm most interested in. And in some
Mm,
way, it finds itself into almost everything I write, this idea of like, what does compromise and complicity do to your soul, to your sense of right and wrong, to your conscience, to your kind of moral North Star, whatever you want to use? Um, like, what does when you compromise over and over again out of political expediency, what does that do to a person? And I ask that, and I'm fascinated with it. I think and I think it's important to say this up front, in part because we all struggle with these things. And I think if I'm being honest with myself, I have often struggled with this question of like um, my own ambition versus my conscience, right? Like there is often a tension between what is the most expedient or convenient thing for me to do versus what I think the right thing to do is. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all face those questions a lot of the time. And so I don't claim to be, this like exceptionally righteous, judge of this. But what I do think is important is that we need to keep acknowledging that tension and allow our conscience, our sense of right and wrong to maintain a strong pull in that kind of tug of war, right? At the very least. And I think that what happens is, like I said earlier, people who decide that they don't want to live in the cognitive dissonance, they don't want to sit in that tension for too long, can do one of two things. They can give up their ambition, right? So that it's not kind of pulling against their conscience, or they can basically give up their claim to right and wrong. And sometimes that manifests in a really nihilistic kind of like, I just want power. I'm not even going to worry about whether this is right. More often, I think it comes in the form of self-justification and rationalization, which is, yeah, and Mitt Romney talked about this too. Like he said, like the reason you rationalize is so that you don't have to live with it, right? And he said,
mm,
like, I go back to like moments early in my political career, he told me, like, for example, where he kind of compromised his position on abortion a couple different times to win various elections. And what he said was, I could have taken a lie detector test and passed it and said, this is what I truly believe, because I convinced myself that it was what I believed, right? Um, in retrospect, in hindsight, he could see that he had convinced himself to believe that because it was the politically expedient position to hold. But the rationalization was powerful. His ability to rationalize was really strong. And I think we see that all over politics and all over various spheres of power, whether it's business or media or tech or whatever. I think we are in a moment where a lot of people are selling out without acknowledging to themselves that they're selling out,
mm.
right? And I do think that, not to get too like spiritual or religious here, but I think that can't help but take a toll on your spiritual well-being, your soul, right? I think it weakens your ability to exercise that moral muscle. And again, I'm not asking for perfection from our public leaders because I certainly am not perfect, but I think that like at the very least, we should expect that they keep exercising the muscle, that they
Right.
keep wrestling with the tension between what's right and what's easy or convenient. Because as soon as you give up that wrestle, it's very hard to pick it back up again.
One of the things that stuck with me, you wrote a piece at the end of November titled "A Horror Movie About an Atheist Who Won't Shut Up." And one of the things you said is faith, much to the frustration of the world's Mr. Reeds, is not something one can be talked out of. Has your faith been shaken at all by whether it's something, things that have happened in your life, or just what you see happening in our country right now?
My faith in God has not been shaken by what's happening in the world. If anything, I think I feel more a need for that faith than ever. But whether my faith's been tested or shaken over the course of my life, of course it has, right? Like, I think that to be somebody who has faith is to constantly have it tested and to have it evolve and to go through periods of doubt and self-questioning and then to experience really special experience, moments where you feel that closeness with God or whatever. I mean, I think that um, I do think that at this moment, one thing that I've anecdotally seen a lot of is people really struggling with how religion and especially kind of Christianity in America has interacted with this political moment, right? And I think a lot of people have allowed a certain kind of very public, very political Christian um, kind of define Christianity at large in ways that drive them away from their faith. And I think that's really tragic because I actually would argue that Christianity transcends politics, and I think that any kind of effort to politically co-opt politic or Christianity ultimately is nothing close to what it is, right? What it should be. But I do think that a lot of people are losing their faith because they're seeing uh, self-professed Christians get on board with things that they find really kind of morally repugnant. And I think that's going to be a thing that I've actually spoken to religious leaders who say that something that a reason they don't like Trump being the center of national attention every day is that it makes it very hard for them to keep young people in the faith, in the pews, coming back to church because it's very disillusioning to them. It has not been that way for me, but I certainly understand why people feel that way.
One of the best arguments I've read. Okay, if the author is listening, the best argument I've read, at least in the last 5 years, is John Rauch's book that came out earlier
Oh
this
yeah.
year, Cross Purposes, and he made what's so ironic is that he's an atheist, yet he made the most robust argument for the need for a healthy church
Yeah.
as part of our democracy, keeping in mind the two parts of the First Amendment, that the Establishment Clause along with the Free Expression Clause. But man, so I'm assuming it sounds like you've read John's book.
I've read it. I interviewed him at Politics and Prose, the DC
Oh,
bookstore here, about it. Um, it's so fascinating, and we could probably do a whole podcast about it. But you should have him on, John. If you're listening, come on the podcast to
okay.
talk
So
about it.
so
Come
John
on.
has actually been on about a half a dozen times. He's one of my favorite people on the face of the
Oh, okay,
planet. So,
okay. So has he talked about the book
yeah,
already?
yeah, yeah,
Okay, all
yeah,
right. So then you don't need the pitch. He is, but his argument about kind of Christianity's foundational importance to Madisonian democracy is, I
yeah.
think, really novel and really interesting. And what he basically argues is that, like, for America to succeed, for a liberal democracy like America's to succeed, you need Christianity to be part of it, right?
Mm.
He doesn't believe in Christianity. He doesn't believe, at least in the kind of truth claims and the divinity and of all of it. But he does believe that as an ideology, as a philosophy, and as a kind of social structure, it's crucial to democracy. And I really think that's true. I mean, again, I think you could take or leave Christianity as a belief system, but it's really hard to look at politics in our rapidly secularizing age and say that we've gotten more enlightened or that our politics has gotten more rational or moderate, which is, I think, what a lot of people, including John, were predicting 20 years ago, right?
Mm.
At the height of kind of the new atheist movement, there was this idea that, the secularization of America and the Western world in general would lead to greater enlightenment, greater moderation, better functioning democracies. And I think the exact opposite has happened, because what's happened is people have replaced their religious passions with political passions in really unproductive ways. And frankly, I just don't think politics fills that God-shaped void the way that church does, that religion does, that God does, right? And it leads to a lot of ennui and anger and frustration that we're seeing manifest in our society. And one of the reasons that I think he wanted me to kind of interview him about the book is that he has this whole chapter in his book about Mormonism
Right.
and kind of its approach to its civic theology, right? And um, I thought it was one of those cases where the way that he wrote about it was sort of eye-opening to me, even as a practicing Mormon, because I saw things in the way he described Latter-day Saint theology that I had not quite thought of in the way that he had. But I do think that, like, fundamentally, we need more serious engagement with religion in the public sphere. I don't think we need more kind of aesthetic, highly politicized extremist religion in the public sphere. We have plenty of that already, and I think it's been pretty counterproductive to
Yeah.
democracy. But I just think it's really hard to look at societal trends and conclude that this new secular age that we're in has been a rollicking triumph.
Right. Right. All right. I only have two more questions because I want to get you out of here in 9 minutes or less. The TPNR question I ask everyone: what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
I think it is possible. I would say, maybe to bring this conversation full circle, I I think that, again, curiosity is an underrated virtue in politics and in our kind of civic life. I think that approaching people in a spirit of wanting to learn from them and understand them, um, and get questions answered, rather than with a set of assumptions about them that are impossible to dispel, uh, is the beginning of kind of healing the kind of democratic culture that we're in. I just think that, like, it is so easy now in all of, as we all live in our kind of algorithmically tailored information bubbles, to assume that we understand everybody who disagrees with us already, and assume that their minds can't be changed and that they could never change our minds, and that we're better off just not talking to them or interacting or living among them or whatever. And I just think I've had enough experiences in my life that have proven that wrong, that I just really distrust that instinct. Like, I have found over and over again that when somebody has a really irrational belief, or a belief that you think is really irrational, if you talk to them for long enough about it, it will seem at least 50% more rational than you thought, right? It still might seem a little irrational, or you still might really strongly disagree with it on kind of moral grounds or whatever, but you will at least understand where they're coming from. And I just think that we don't have enough patience for that in our culture right now, and I think we could use a lot more patience and curiosity.
Curiosity is the cure. Somewhere Monica Guzman is smiling. Um, do you have any questions for me?
Man, I actually just want to ask you like a million questions about trailers and teasers, but we won't do that now. Um, well, I guess my question would be, like, do you feel like we are turning a corner in our kind of secular age? You hear a lot of people describe this as actually a post-secular moment, that like people in the West are starting to recognize the failures of secularism, recognize the importance of religion, and that there is more kind of, at the very least, curiosity about faith or openness to spiritual experiences. Like, have you're having these conversations all the time. Are you seeing something shift in our culture to that effect?
I want to think about this a lot more because I can't give you a sociological, the way Ryan Burge's, numbers on
Sure.
this. I can tell you from my experience with people that I'm very close to, like my kids. My kids are 24, 21, and 20. I can tell you from my experiences talking to people, in the evangelical church, which I'm a part of, and as well as the entertainment industry, which I'm a part of, and across a lot of these concentric circles in my life, what I'm seeing is that there is an increased longing for ingredients of faith, meaning there's a burgeoning desire or recognition of a need to be among people, to have
Yeah.
a sense of community and connectedness with a small circle of folks, and even for ritual or practice in a way, however that might look, that you're tapping into. In my case, I know it in my own life. Like I'm a Christian, but I grew up in a very observant Jewish family. We did the Seder, the Passover
Hmm.
Seder a week ago, because I feel like that is us participating in the story of our people. By retelling the story of our people in a ritual way, we're participating in that story as well. And my kids are all at different places in their own journeys, in terms of what they're believing, and they're forming their own beliefs, which I think in a way is honoring God. Part of the greatest commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. They're honoring God with their mind
Yeah.
by asking these sincere questions. As scary as it is for me that they'll come out with the wrong answers, that's a really important process to go through. So I do see certain ingredients, the need and the desire to be with people, and certain, whether it's rituals or practices or get-togethers that have that reach toward a sense of transcendence. So those
Yeah.
are a couple of things that I see now that I wasn't seeing in the mid 20 teens quite as
Hmm.
much. So
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I feel like I'm seeing that anecdotally all the time,
yeah.
and I think it's exciting. I'm actually optimistic about where kind of conversations about faith will be going in the next kind of decade here in America. I think there's a lot of interesting things happening.
Yeah, for sure. You just all of a sudden, I thought of some of the greatest fiction writers of the last 500 years came out of Russia.
Yeah,
At different points so when or some of the greatest thinkers came out of Germany at,
yeah.
in the first half of the 20th century. But that's a whole other podcast. So before we go, how can folks find you, follow your work, and all the great writing that you're doing with The Atlantic and everywhere else?
Yeah, so theatlantic.com, you can find my author page there. I'll have a story if my hope my editor is listening, hopefully next week.
Okay.
I and you can find me on Twitter at McKay Coppins, and McKayaldencoppins.com is my website. Come
Awesome.
come reach out.
McKay, this was really a pleasure. I'm so grateful to have been able to speak with you. I hope it's not the last time we hang out.
I
And
would love to.
yeah, yeah.
I want to beat the John Roush half a dozen times. How can I get to seven? That's the question.
Oh, there you
Seven
go. There's going to be
appearances.
a jacket, like a varsity
Yeah,
jacket for the
exactly.
Seven Club or something like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that. That's awesome.
I'm
Thanks.
competitive with John. All right, thanks a lot.
Yeah, you bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please remember to follow the show, write the review, and now you can watch these conversations on YouTube. Support us on Patreon. It's youtube.com/@politicsandreligion. I'm Corey S. Nathan. You know where to find me. Everything makes a difference. It really does help. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect. Have a great week.